Jonathan crouched low behind the rock, sweat trickling down his face as he scanned the alien landscape. The jungle was dense, with thick, towering trees and vines that twisted like snakes. His mission was clear: find the alien princess and get her back to his ship. Easy enough, except that this was no ordinary rescue. The princess wasn't just any alien royalty. She was the daughter of the queen of one of the most powerful factions in the galaxy, and getting caught meant death. He adjusted his blaster, his pulse racing. The air smelled of damp earth and strange, exotic flowers, the kind that made his skin itch. He wiped his brow, trying to steady his breathing. He had trained for this, but nothing could have prepared him for the strange feeling creeping up his spine. Something was off. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from the thick underbrush ahead of him. Jonathan froze. The alien princess was close, and if he didn't act fast, the enemy could close in. He shifted silently, moving between the shadows of the trees, his military training kicking in as he prepared to make his move. Then, through the thick foliage, he saw her. At first, Jonathan thought she was a mirage. She was tall and graceful, her skin shimmering like polished silver under the dim light filtering through the trees. Her long, flowing hair was a deep shade of violet, almost otherworldly. She moved effortlessly, like she was part of the jungle itself. Her eyes, large and glowing with an ethereal light, scanned the area with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. This was no ordinary princess. This was Lyra, the daughter of the alien queen, and Jonathan's heart skipped a beat at the sight of her. He had heard stories, of course, but seeing her in person was something entirely different. She looked like she belonged to another world. Her skin had an iridescent glow and her movements were as fluid as the wind. She wasn't just beautiful, she was powerful, like a force of nature. Yet, despite her elegance, there was a look of fear in her eyes. Jonathan knew he had to act, quickly. He stepped forward, the leaves crunching beneath his boots. She turned toward him in an instant, her eyes locking onto his with a mixture of fear and confusion. Before he could say a word, she raised a sleek, metallic weapon in his direction. "Stay back," she commanded, her voice sharp and commanding despite the tremor in her hands. Her accent was unfamiliar, but Jonathan understood the urgency in her tone. Jonathan raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm here to help you," he said in a calm, steady voice. "I'm not your enemy." Her weapon didn't lower. In fact, she seemed ready to pull the trigger at any moment. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest as he quickly considered his options. The last thing he wanted was to make an enemy out of the alien princess. "I know you're scared," Jonathan said, his voice softening. "But we're in danger here. We need to get out before they find us." The princess studied him, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly. She seemed to be weighing his words, the tension thick in the air. Jonathan kept his hands raised, not wanting to provoke her. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant rustle of leaves. Then, to his surprise, she slowly lowered her weapon, though she didn't seem entirely convinced. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice still cautious. "What do you want with me?" "I'm Jonathan," he said, taking a careful step forward. "I'm a soldier. I was sent to rescue you. You're in danger." "Danger?" Her voice was sharp again. "I don't need rescuing." "I think you do," Jonathan replied, glancing around nervously. "This planet's not as safe as it looks. There are people after you, and we need to leave before they find us." Lyra hesitated. Her sharp eyes darted to the sky as if expecting something to come crashing down at any moment. Finally, she seemed to make a decision. She nodded slowly, though the wariness never left her face. "I'll go with you," she said, her voice low but firm. "But don't think for a second I trust you." Jonathan exhaled slowly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He couldn't afford to let his guard down either. There was no telling who else might be watching them, and no matter how beautiful or powerful the princess was, she was still an alien, and he was human. "Fair enough," Jonathan said, his voice laced with both relief and caution. "Follow me. Stay close." They moved through the jungle in silence, the dense trees offering some cover but also making the path forward treacherous. Jonathan led the way, keeping his senses alert for any signs of danger. Lyra kept up without complaint, her steps almost silent despite the underbrush. As they traveled, Jonathan couldn't help but glance over at her. She was unlike anyone he had ever met. Her otherworldly beauty was undeniable, but it wasn't just that. There was something fierce in her demeanor, something he hadn't expected from an alien princess. She wasn't just royalty. She was a warrior in her own right. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. There was a strange energy between them, an unspoken tension that neither of them acknowledged but both felt. They were from different worlds with different goals, yet here they were, thrown together by fate. The journey wasn't an easy one. The jungle was alive with dangerous creatures, and they had to keep moving swiftly to avoid detection. Lyra moved, with grace, her long violet hair flowing behind her like a shadow in the wind, and Jonathan couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. She was nothing like he had imagined. And then, as they reached a clearing, Jonathan heard it. A faint noise. In the distance, footsteps, lots of them. He tensed, signaling for Lyra to stop. His heart raced as he realized they weren't alone. The enemy was closing in. Lyra's eyes widened. She knew, just like he did, that they didn't have much time. "We have to move," Jonathan whispered urgently. "Now." Jonathan's heart raced as he pulled Lyra deeper into the thick jungle, his eyes scanning every shadow and every rustling leaf. The distant sound of approaching footsteps was growing louder, and he knew they didn't have much time. Lyra, her violet hair whipping around her face, moved with an eerie silence, her footsteps barely making a sound on the soft forest floor. Jonathan couldn't help but admire her poise, despite the chaos unfolding around them. The footsteps were getting closer, and Jonathan's thoughts were a blur. "We need to find a place to hide," he whispered urgently. He scanned their surroundings, trying to find any cover that could keep them out of sight. He was a soldier, trained for moments like this, but nothing in his training had prepared him for a situation like this, alone in an alien jungle with a princess who could probably kill him without breaking a sweat if she wanted to. "Over there," Lyra murmured, pointing to a thick cluster of trees on the edge of the clearing. Jonathan nodded quickly, urging her to follow. They dashed for the cover, ducking low to the ground as they moved. Jonathan's pulse pounded in his ears. The footsteps had stopped, and he felt the air grow tense. They reached the cluster of trees and crouched down, Jonathan pressing his back against the rough bark of one of the trunks. He motioned for Lyra to do the same. She obeyed silently, her glowing eyes scanning the clearing with an alertness that told Jonathan she was no stranger to danger. As they huddled together, Jonathan couldn't help but glance at her. In the dim light, Lyra looked almost ethereal. Her alien features were mesmerizing. Her skin shimmered in the faint moonlight, and her eyes seemed to glow with a wisdom far beyond her years. She was more than just a princess. She was a survivor, just like him. The thought made him feel strangely at ease despite the perilous situation. "What now?" Lyra asked quietly, her voice calm but laced with tension. Jonathan held his breath, listening carefully. The footsteps had returned, and now there was a sound of movement just outside their hiding spot. He could almost feel the danger closing in. His mind raced as he formulated a plan. He knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. "I'll distract them," Jonathan said in a low whisper. "You find a way out." Lyra looked at him, a flicker of uncertainty crossing her features. "What do you mean, distract them? You're human. You can't fight them all." Jonathan gave her a small, reassuring smile. "I'm not trying to fight them. I'll create a diversion, and while they're focused on me, you make a run for it. Get to the ship. I'll meet you there." Lyra seemed to consider his words for a moment, and Jonathan could see the conflict in her eyes. She was clearly capable, strong even, but her trust in him was still untested. "No," she finally said, her voice firm. "We do this together. I won't leave you behind." Jonathan was surprised by the force in her words. Her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time, He saw something more than just royalty in them. He saw a person who cared. She wasn't just an alien princess removed from the struggles of everyday life. She was real, just like him. And, despite everything, he felt an unexpected surge of respect for her. "I'm not asking you to leave me behind," he said, his voice steady. "But this is a dangerous mission, and we both know we don't have much time. We have to take the best shot we can." Lyra didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced at the entrance to their hiding spot, her sharp eyes scanning the darkening jungle. Jonathan could feel the tension mounting between them. She was strong-willed, and he couldn't blame her for being hesitant. Trust was not something easily earned, especially in a situation like this. But then, to his surprise, she nodded. "Fine," she said quietly. "We'll do it your way. But I want to make sure we both get out of this." Jonathan gave her a slight smile, his heart pounding in his chest. There was something about the way she spoke, her voice determined and resolute, that made him feel like they actually stood a chance. "Deal," he replied. "Stay close. And be ready." They waited in tense silence as the sounds of their enemies grew nearer. Jonathan knew his distraction needed to be quick and effective. As the footsteps came into view, he took a deep breath and prepared to act. Just as the first figure entered the clearing, Jonathan made his move. He pushed against the tree with all his strength and rolled out from behind it, making sure to land, with a loud crash. The noise echoed through the jungle, and he saw the first soldier, their pursuer, turn toward the sound. "Over here!" Jonathan yelled, waving his arms to draw their attention. His voice echoed in the quiet jungle, loud enough to confuse his enemies, but not so loud that it would give away his exact position. He could feel his heart racing, but he pushed the fear aside. This was his moment to buy Lyra some time. Pew! Soldiers turned toward him, their attention now focused entirely on him. Jonathan quickly darted between trees, creating as much noise as he could without being seen. He had to keep them occupied long enough for Lyra to get away. As he sprinted, he heard the crackling of underbrush behind him. He didn't dare look back. He had no time to second-guess himself. Every step was calculated, every move precise. But his thoughts kept returning to Lyra. She was strong, but she was also vulnerable. He had to trust that she would find a way to escape. Jonathan's chest burned with each breath, but he kept running, his focus sharp. He could hear the soldiers shouting, their voices growing more frantic as they tried to keep up with him. But Jonathan knew the jungle better than they did. He had spent years training in environments like this, and as much as he hated to admit it, this was his advantage. He could feel his pursuers closing in, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet, not while Lyra was depending on him. Meanwhile, Lyra had taken Jonathan's advice. She moved swiftly, her sharp eyes scanning every path, as she maneuvered through the dense jungle. Jonathan's distraction had worked. The soldiers were following him, and she had a moment to escape. But she wasn't going to leave him behind, not after everything they'd been through. As she moved deeper into the jungle, her thoughts shifted. She was starting to realize that humans weren't the simple, weak creatures she had been taught to fear. Jonathan had shown her kindness, something she had never expected from someone like him. And now, in the middle of this alien world, it was her turn to trust him. The jungle was alive with the sounds of distant chaos as Jonathan sprinted through the underbrush. His legs burned with each stride, but he didn't slow down. He couldn't afford to. The soldiers were closing in, and if they caught him, Lyra wouldn't stand a chance. He could hear their shouts, their voices growing louder with every second. They were after him. But Jonathan had a plan. It wasn't perfect, but it was his only shot. He darted behind a large tree, crouching low and holding his breath. The soldiers were only a few meters away now. He could hear them, feel the vibrations of their footsteps in the earth. His heart raced, but he steadied himself. He had to think. He glanced around quickly and saw a cluster of thick vines hanging from the branches above. Without a second thought, he grabbed the nearest vine and swung it around a large rock, tying it as quickly as he could. The sound of the soldiers' footsteps grew louder, closer. He had no time to lose. With a swift motion, Jonathan swung the vine over his shoulder, the rope now rigged to pull. As soon as the soldiers entered the clearing, he yanked hard. The vine snapped tight and the rock flew through the air, crashing with a loud bang against a nearby tree. The soldiers turned at the noise, their confusion palpable. Jonathan used the distraction to slip back into the shadows, moving silently through the jungle. He was sure they would figure out the trick soon, but it would buy him a few more moments that could make all the difference. Meanwhile, Lyra had already made her way deeper into the jungle, her heart pounding in her chest. She had heard the distraction Jonathan created, and as she ran, she felt an odd mixture of fear and hope. Jonathan had given her a chance to escape. She couldn't fail him now. But even as she ran, the uncertainty gnawed at her. She had never relied on anyone before, certainly not a human. Yet, there was something about Jonathan's presence that made her feel like she wasn't alone in this strange world. She knew that leaving him behind would mean more danger for both of them, but she couldn't let herself be caught. The soldiers were relentless, and if they got their hands on her again, the consequences would be dire. Suddenly, a chilling thought struck her. What if Jonathan couldn't escape? A sense of urgency surged through her and she pushed herself harder, faster. She had to reach the ship. She had to survive, if only to return the favor to Jonathan. She didn't know why she felt such an intense need to protect him, but the thought of losing him didn't sit well with her. Her glowing eyes scanned the jungle, looking for signs of danger. The thick trees and towering vines provided some cover, but the sound of soldiers calling out for her echoed in the distance. They were searching for her, and it wouldn't be long before they found her trail. In the midst of her run, a new sound cut through the air, a low hum, steady and powerful. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She recognized the sound. It was the sound of her mother's ships. She had arrived. Back in the clearing, Jonathan's plan was working. The soldiers were still confused by the rock that had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, but Jonathan knew they wouldn't stay confused for long. They would figure it out. They were trained, and they would know soon enough that he was playing them. His mind raced. He had to think quickly. The soldiers were getting closer, and they would be on him any second now. He knew he couldn't outrun them. His only option was to make them come to him. He had to keep them occupied long enough for Lyra to get away. Jonathan crouched behind another tree, his fingers tightening around his blaster. He had never been in a situation like this before, fighting not just for survival, but for the safety of someone else. Someone he barely knew. The princess. His thoughts turned to her as the soldiers finally came into view. He didn't have time to dwell on it. This wasn't about understanding the strange bond he felt for her. This was about survival. He took a deep breath and stepped out from behind the tree. He raised his blaster and fired a few warning shots into the air, hoping to confuse them. The soldiers immediately dropped into a defensive stance, their weapons raised in unison. "Human!" one of the soldiers shouted, his voice harsh and commanding. "You can't hide forever. We'll find you." Jonathan smirked, trying to keep his voice steady. "You'll have to catch me first," he called back. He darted into the underbrush, moving quickly and silently. The soldiers followed, their heavy footsteps thundering behind him. Meanwhile, high above the jungle, a shadow cast over the land. The massive ships of the alien queen were descending, their dark silhouettes cutting through the clouds. The sound of their engines was deafening, and Lyra could feel the air around her vibrate with their power. Her heart swelled with a strange mix of relief and anxiety. Her mother had arrived. Lyra stopped running for a moment, her gaze fixed on the ships in the sky. She had been brought up to understand the power her mother wielded, the strength of the alien queen's empire. But right now she couldn't help but feel an unfamiliar sense of dread. Her mother's wrath was a force of nature, a power that could bring entire civilizations to their knees. And she had no idea how her mother would respond when she learned of the human who had saved her daughter. Would the queen see Jonathan as an ally, or would he be seen as an enemy? The queen was not known for her mercy. Lyra's thoughts were interrupted as the ships touched down, their massive engines kicking up a storm of dust and debris. The soldiers in the jungle immediately dropped to their knees, recognizing the arrival of their queen. They had failed in their mission, and they knew the consequences. Jonathan, however, had no time to think about the arrival of the queen. He had his own fight to finish. The soldiers were closing in, and his body was beginning to feel the strain of running and hiding. But he had come this far, and there was no way he was going to stop now. He had to keep them distracted, keep them away from Lyra long enough for her to escape. Jonathan's legs burned as he sprinted through the thick underbrush, but there was no slowing down now. The soldiers were right behind him, their heavy boots thundering against the jungle floor, their voices shouting orders to each other. He didn't dare look back. He knew better. Every time he risked a glance, the gap between him and the soldiers seemed to close just a little bit more. His breath came in short gasps, his heart pounding in his chest. He had been trained to survive in hostile environments, but this was something different. This wasn't just about evading enemies, it was about keeping Lyra safe, about making sure she got the chance to escape. She had to make it. He couldn't fail her. A sharp crack echoed in the jungle, followed by a scream. Jonathan's heart stopped. He knew that sound all too well. Lyra. Without thinking, Jonathan veered off the path and bolted in the direction of the sound. His mind raced as he pushed his body harder, faster. The soldiers had to be close. He could feel the pressure building, but he refused to stop. He burst through a thicket of trees and froze. Lyra was standing there, her back against a tree, her eyes wide with panic. The soldiers had her surrounded. Their weapons were aimed directly at her, and there was nothing Jonathan could do. He was too far away, the soldiers were too many. "Lyra!" he yelled, his voice raw with urgency. She turned at the sound of his voice, her eyes locking onto his with a mixture of relief and fear. Her lips parted, as if to say something, but the words died in her throat. Jonathan could see the terror in her eyes, but there was something else too. A strange determination. The soldiers took a step forward, their weapons still trained on her, but they didn't move any closer. They were waiting for their orders, waiting for the queen. Jonathan didn't have time to think. He raised his blaster and fired a warning shot into the air. The soldiers flinched but didn't retreat. They were too well trained. Jonathan's hand shook, but he tightened his grip on the weapon, not allowing the fear to overtake him. "I'll take care of this," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his heart. "Just hold on." Before he could make his move, a deep, resonant voice cut through the air. "Enough." The soldiers immediately dropped to one knee, their heads bowed in submission. Jonathan froze. His eyes darted up to see the source of the voice. There, standing in the clearing, was the alien queen. She was taller than any human, her imposing figure draped in an elegant cloak of shimmering silver, her eyes glowing with an otherworldly light fixed on Jonathan, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The queen's presence was like a storm, a force of nature that could not be ignored. She radiated power. Jonathan felt a shiver run down his spine. Lyra stepped forward, her expression softening as she looked at her mother. "Mom," she said quietly, her voice trembling with emotion. "You're here." The queen's eyes softened for just a moment before her gaze shifted to Jonathan. Her expression hardened instantly. "And you," she said, her voice cold and sharp. "What is this human doing here? Why is my daughter with him?" Jonathan swallowed hard, stepping forward cautiously. He knew this moment was crucial. He had no idea how the queen would react, but he couldn't back down now. I'm Jonathan," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "I rescued your daughter. She was in danger. I was just trying to get her to safety." The queen's eyes narrowed. "You saved her?" she asked, her tone disbelieving. "How did you even find her?" "I was sent on a mission," Jonathan explained, his voice calm, though his hands were still shaking. "I didn't know it would be like this. But when I found her, I knew I couldn't just leave her behind. I had to help." The queen's gaze flickered to her daughter, then back to Jonathan. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Something like recognition. "You don't understand, do you?" the Queen said, her voice low and dangerous. "You've put yourself in danger. Do you realize the consequences of what you've done?" Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. "I didn't mean to." "You think that saving her makes you a hero?" the Queen interrupted. "You're a human. You are nothing compared to the power we possess." Jonathan stood his ground, though the Queen's words stung. He had known this wasn't going to be easy, but hearing her say it so coldly made him realize just how out of his depth he was. He wasn't just fighting for his life anymore. He was fighting for Lyra's future, for the chance that there might be more to their connection than just a simple rescue. "I don't care about power," Jonathan said, his voice unwavering. "I care about her. She didn't deserve what happened to her, no one does." The Queen's eyes studied him carefully. She said nothing for a long moment. The silence was thick with tension, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on them. All. Finally she spoke, her voice quieter but no less powerful. "You're right," she said, her gaze softening ever so slightly. "She didn't deserve it." Jonathan didn't know what to say to that. He could see that the Queen was struggling with something. Her powerful facade had cracked just for a moment. He didn't know what was going through her mind, but he had a feeling that the consequences of his actions weren't as clear-cut as he had first thought. Lyra stepped forward then, her face filled with a mixture of hope and fear. "Mother," she said, her voice trembling, "Jonathan didn't do anything wrong. He saved me. He didn't have to, but he did." The Queen's gaze shifted to her daughter, and Jonathan could see the flicker of emotion in her eyes. But the Queen's face hardened again, and she turned her attention back to him. "You may have saved my daughter, human," she said, her voice calm but stern. "But understand this. You have no idea what you've just gotten yourself into. There are things happening here that are far beyond your comprehension." Jonathan felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He had a feeling that this was far from over. "But," the Queen continued, her tone shifting ever so slightly, "for now I will allow you to live. You've earned that. But do not mistake my mercy for weakness." Jonathan nodded, not daring to speak, unsure of what to expect next. Lyra, standing beside him, gave him a small, almost imperceptible smile. It was a rare gesture, one that filled him with hope in the face of the unknown. The jungle was quiet now, the only sounds being the soft rustle of the wind through the trees. Jonathan stood still, trying to steady his breath, as he watched the Queen, immense, powerful, and every bit the ruler she appeared to be. Lyra stood beside him, her presence a quiet strength, and even though her mother had spared them both, Jonathan could feel the weight of the Queen's decision pressing on him. The Queen had ordered the soldiers to stand down, but she hadn't given them any instructions beyond that. Her eyes, glowing with the wisdom of 1,000 years, were focused on him, her expression unreadable. Jonathan shifted nervously under her gaze. Every instinct told him to stand tall, to act with confidence, but in truth, he was anything but confident. He had just been given a temporary reprieve, but the threat of danger still loomed. The Queen had shown mercy, yes, but how long would it last? "You're lucky, human," the Queen finally spoke, her voice steady but tinged with a cold edge. "Not many would be given a second chance." Jonathan swallowed, trying to gather his thoughts. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said, his voice steady, but laced with a hint of frustration. "I didn't ask to be here, I didn't ask to rescue her, but I did it because it was the right thing to do." The Queen's eyes narrowed slightly, but there was something in her gaze that softened. "The right thing to do?" she echoed. "You humans often speak of morality as if it's simple, but this is no simple matter." Jonathan had no words for her, but his mind raced. What did she mean by that? Was she implying that his actions were naive? That in her world, morality wasn't black and white? Lyra, sensing the tension, stepped forward, placing a hand on Jonathan's arm. Her touch was light, but it grounded him. He looked at her, and for a moment all the chaos, all the danger they had been through, seemed to fade into the background. "Mother," Lyra said softly, her voice full of a quiet authority, Jonathan didn't just save me because it was the right thing to do. He saved me because he cared. I know he's human, but he's not like the others I've met. He's different. Jonathan's chest tightened at her words. He had never imagined that Lyra would speak so openly about him, especially to her mother. But the Queen's gaze softened just a fraction. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. The Queen looked down at her daughter, her expression shifting, from cold calculation to something else, something like tenderness. But it was fleeting, as if she had to hide it, to bury it beneath her royal mask. I know you care for him, the Queen said quietly, her voice almost a whisper. And I suppose, in a way, he has earned his place here, for now. Jonathan tensed, unsure of where this was heading. But Lyra spoke again, her voice firm and full of resolve. Mother, Jonathan deserves more than just a temporary place. He's already proven himself. He risked everything to save me. Don't you see that? He's not like the humans we've encountered before. I don't want to lose him because of our differences. The Queen's eyes flashed with something Jonathan couldn't quite read. I see, daughter, she said, her voice calm and deliberate. But you don't understand what's at stake here. We cannot afford to trust him fully, not yet. There are things happening in this galaxy, things much bigger than one human and one alien princess. His presence complicates matters. He's a threat, and that threat cannot be ignored. Jonathan's stomach churned. I'm not a threat, he said, his voice tight but controlled. I'm not here to destroy anything. I don't want power. I just want to make sure she's safe. The Queen studied him for a long moment, her gaze unwavering. It was as if she was weighing his very soul, searching for any sign of dishonesty. Jonathan stood tall, his heart racing. He had no choice but to stand firm. He wasn't lying. His only concern was Lyra's safety. Finally, the Queen nodded, though there was no smile, no warmth in her eyes. Very well, she said. You've earned the right to remain alive for now. Jonathan felt a wave of relief wash over him. He had expected the worst, but this was better than he had imagined. Yet, as the Queen's words sank in, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. She hadn't promised him anything. She hadn't given him her trust. However, the Queen continued, her voice colder now, you will be closely watched. You will stay in the palace under my protection, but do not think for one moment that you are free from suspicion. If you prove yourself worthy of my daughter's trust, then perhaps we can discuss your future here. But do not test me, human. Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. He understood. This wasn't over. He had survived, yes, but the real challenge was just beginning. Lyra stepped closer to him, her presence a comfort. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, though the worry in her eyes remained. Jonathan could see it in the way she stood, the slight tension in her posture. She, too, knew that their lives had changed forever. The Queen turned to leave, her presence still commanding the jungle. You have one more chance, human, she said, her voice echoing in the quiet air. Do not waste it. As she walked away, her guards falling in behind her, Jonathan let out a long breath. He had made it. For now, he was alive. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play, something that neither he nor Lyra could fully understand. Lyra turned to him then, her gaze soft but filled with a new sense of determination. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice full of emotion. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't been here. Jonathan smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. I didn't do it for thanks. I did it because I had to. Lyra looked at him for a long moment, and Jonathan could feel the weight of everything they had been through. Their bond, unexpected as it was, had already grown stronger than he had anticipated. And though they were far from safe, he knew one thing, for certain, he wasn't leaving her. Not now. Not ever. Jonathan stood in the grand hall of the Queen's palace, feeling the weight of everything that had happened in the last few days. His mission had started as a simple rescue operation, but now, standing in the heart of an alien empire, he realized just how much bigger this was. The Queen's words echoed in his mind. You are under my protection, but you are also under suspicion. It was clear that he was far from being trusted, and the Queen's offer of protection felt more like a careful observation. He had never been so out of place in his life. The palace was vast, its walls gleaming with alien technology that Jonathan couldn't even begin to understand. Everywhere he looked, there were guards, servants, and alien beings going about their business, none of them paying him much attention, yet all of them keeping an eye on him. Lyra had been with him since they arrived, but the palace was a maze of corridors and chambers, and they hadn't spoken much since they were granted entry. She had been quiet, her mind clearly elsewhere. Jonathan couldn't help but wonder how it felt for her, being back in the palace after everything that had happened, the things she had gone through. He knew she wasn't the same as when he first met her. It wasn't long before Lyra appeared. In the doorway, her figure framed by the soft light from the hallway, she looked different now, not just in the way she carried herself, but in the way she held her head high. There was a new strength in her gaze, but also a hint of sadness. She was still processing everything, and Jonathan knew that would take time. It wasn't just about surviving. It was about learning to live with the consequences of their actions. Jonathan, she said, her voice soft but steady, I've been thinking. Jonathan looked up from where he stood near the window, watching the sunset over the alien city below. About what? About all of this. She gestured vaguely at the palace around them. About my mother and what she said. About you. Jonathan frowned slightly. What about me? Lyra hesitated for a moment, her fingers twisting nervously around the hem of her sleeve. She seemed to be choosing her words carefully, as if each one carried a weight that she hadn't fully understood before. You said you were here because it was the right thing to do, she began. And I know that. I know you didn't want anything in return, but Jonathan's gaze softened. He stepped toward her slowly. But what? She looked him directly in the eyes, her gaze unflinching. But you didn't have to do it. You didn't have to save me. You didn't have to risk your life for someone like me. You didn't know who I was or who my mother was. You didn't know how dangerous it would be. Jonathan sighed, taking a step closer to her. I didn't care about that, he said quietly. I didn't do it because of who you are. I did it because you were in danger, and I couldn't just leave you behind. Lyra's expression softened. I know, she said. But that's what I don't understand. You're a human. You have your own people, your own life, and yet you still chose to help me. Why? Jonathan didn't have an easy answer. He had never thought about it in such a deep way. When he was out there in the jungle saving her, it had felt instinctive. He hadn't stopped to think about the why. But now, standing in front of her, he realized that there was something more to it. There was a bond growing between them, something neither of them could explain but both of them felt. I guess. He paused, trying to find the right words. I guess I didn't want to see you suffer. I know it sounds simple, but it's true. I saw you and I saw someone who didn't deserve what happened to her. Someone who was just trying to survive just like me. Lyra nodded slowly, her eyes softening. I understand now. I think I understand what you mean. Jonathan could feel the weight in the air shift, the tension between them easing. There was no immediate answer to everything. They didn't know what would happen next, but at that moment, it didn't matter. They were standing in a space of understanding, of connection. I think we need to figure out what's next, Jonathan said, glancing toward the grand double doors that led deeper into the palace. Your mother may have spared me for now, but I don't think she's done deciding what she wants from me. Lyra sighed. My mother doesn't trust you. She won't, not until she knows who you really are. But that's not going to change anything. What you did, it meant something to her too. Jonathan turned back to her, curious. You think so? Lyra gave him a small knowing smile. I do. I've seen it in her eyes. She's not as cold as she seems. She doesn't show it, but she does care. In her own way. Jonathan wasn't sure how to respond. The Queen's demeanor had been anything but warm toward him, but if Lyra said so, maybe there was more to the Queen than what he had seen so far. After all, Lyra was her daughter. She knew her mother better than anyone. Just then a servant entered the room, bowing respectfully. "Your Majesty," she said, addressing Lyra. "Your mother requests your presence in the council chamber. She wishes to discuss matters of great importance." Lyra's expression changed slightly, her eyes growing distant. "Of course. Thank you." As the servant left, Lyra turned back to Jonathan, her face now set in a more serious expression. "It seems we'll have to continue this later. But know this," she said quietly. "I don't regret what happened. I don't regret meeting you. And I don't regret that you saved me. Whatever happens, whatever my mother decides, I won't forget that." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. He gave her a small, sincere smile. "I won't forget either." As she left the room, Jonathan remained where he stood, looking out over the palace grounds. The future was uncertain, and nothing was guaranteed, but in that moment he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Hope for a future where he and Lyra could stand side by side, no matter the obstacles that lay ahead. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light across the palace. Jonathan knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to face whatever came next.